My husband threw out my epilepsy medication and told everyone I was an addict because YouTube convinced him I didn't need pills, until the doctor called the police. I'd been managing my epilepsy for 8 years before I met Craig. I was upfront about it on our third date, explained that I took medication twice a day, and hadn't had a seizure in 5 years thanks to my treatment. He said he admired how I didn't let it define me, and that his cousin had diabetes, so he understood chronic conditions. We dated for 2 years, got married, and everything was fine for about 6 months. Then Craig started getting into wellness podcasts and YouTube channels about natural healing. He'd send me videos about people who cured themselves through diet and positive thinking. I'd politely watch them and say that was interesting. But my neurologist and I had found what worked for me. Craig would say I was being close-minded, and that doctors just wanted to keep me sick for profit. He started buying supplements and leaving them next to my medication with little notes saying try these instead. I ignored them. Then he began timing how long I spent at my neurology appointments, saying $200 every 3 months was robbery for a 15-minute conversation. I explained that those appointments were to monitor my levels and adjust dosages, but he said I'd been on the same dose for 3 years, so clearly it was just a scam. He calculated that my medication cost our insurance $800 a month, and said we could use that money for a vacation if I just tried going without it. I told him that wasn't how insurance worked, and also I could die without my medication. He laughed and said I was being dramatic. One day I came home from my shift at the hospital where I worked as a radiology tech, to find Craig had rearranged the medicine cabinet. He'd put my pills on the highest shelf where I had to use a step stool to reach them. He said it was to make me think twice before taking them. Maybe I'd realize I didn't need them every single time. I moved them back to my regular shelf. He moved them again. This went on for weeks until I started keeping them in my work locker. Craig was furious when he realized what I'd done. He said I was sneaking around like an addict and clearly had a problem. He started researching my medication online and would read me horror stories about side effects. He'd point out every time I forgot a word or felt tired and blame it on the pills destroying my brain. When I got my blood work results showing everything was normal, he said the lab was probably in on the scam with my doctor. He started telling his family I was addicted to prescription drugs. His mother called me concerned, offering to pray for my addiction. His brother asked if I needed an intervention. I had to explain repeatedly that I had epilepsy and needed medication to not have seizures. They'd nod, but then Craig would tell them I was in denial about my addiction, and they'd start the whole cycle again. 6 months ago, I went to refill my prescription, and the pharmacy said it had been canceled. When I called my doctor's office, they said someone identifying as my husband had called saying I wanted to discontinue treatment. I got it sorted out, but when I confronted Craig, he said he was trying to help me see that I'd be fine without the pills. He actually said he'd been watching me, and I seemed totally normal, so obviously I didn't need medication. I started hiding my medication in different places. Behind books, in tampon boxes, in my car. Craig would find them and move them somewhere else, not throwing them out, but making me hunt for them. He said it was a game to make me realize how dependent I'd become. One morning, I couldn't find them anywhere and had to leave for work without taking my dose. Craig texted me that afternoon saying he'd hidden them somewhere special, and I could have them back when I admitted I didn't really need them. I left work early, tore the house apart, and found them in the freezer behind frozen vegetables. I was 3 hours late on my dose and felt awful. That night, I told Craig if he ever touched my medication again, I would leave him. He said I was choosing pills over our marriage. 2 weeks later, I woke up in the emergency room. Craig was there looking terrified. The doctor explained I'd had a grand mal seizure at work, fallen and hit my head on an MRI machine, and had been unconscious for 20 minutes. My coworkers told them I'd been complaining about someone messing with my medication. The doctor asked to speak with me privately, and asked if someone was preventing me from taking my medication. I told him everything. The doctor's face went dark. He asked Craig to step in and very calmly asked him if he'd been interfering with my medication. Craig actually told the doctor that I didn't really need the pills, that I'd been fine for years, and that he was trying to wean me off unnecessary drugs. The doctor asked if he had medical training. Craig said no, but he'd done research. The doctor asked what research. Craig mentioned his podcasts and YouTube videos. The doctor called security and had Craig escorted out. Then he called the police. The police officer arrived about 20 minutes later. She introduced herself as Officer Penn and asked if we could talk privately. The ER doctor nodded and stepped out, leaving just the two of us in the small exam room. I was still wearing a hospital gown, and my head throbbed where I'd hit the MRI machine. Officer Penn pulled a chair close to my bed and opened a small notebook. She asked me to start from the beginning and tell her everything about my medication. I told her about Craig hiding my pills in different places around the house. I explained how he'd canceled my prescription at the pharmacy by pretending to be me. I described finding my medication in the freezer behind frozen vegetables and being 3 hours late on my dose. Officer Penn's expression got darker with each detail I shared. She wrote everything down in careful handwriting and asked specific questions about dates and times. When I mentioned Craig timing my doctor appointments and calling them a scam, she underlined something in her notes. The ER doctor came back in and added his observations about my medication levels being too low and the head injury from the fall. He showed Officer Penn my chart and pointed to numbers that apparently proved I hadn't been taking my medication consistently. Officer Penn asked if Craig had ever physically prevented me from taking my pills, and I said no. He just hid them where I couldn't find them. She wrote that down too. About an hour later, a different doctor arrived. The ER doctor introduced him as Dr. Cooper, my neurologist. I'd been seeing him for 3 years for my regular checkups. Doctor. Cooper looked upset when he walked in and immediately asked if I was okay. He picked up my chart and started reading through the ER notes. His face got tight when he saw the medication levels and the notes about Craig's interference. He flipped through several pages and then set the chart down hard on the counter. Doctor. Cooper turned to Officer Penn and explained that medication tampering for a seizure disorder wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially fatal. He said withdrawal seizures could cause brain damage or death if they lasted too long. Officer Penn asked him to explain that more clearly for her report. Doctor. Cooper sat down and went through the science of how my medication worked and what happened when someone stopped taking it suddenly. He said my body had become dependent on the medication to prevent seizures, and removing it abruptly was like pulling the emergency brake on a moving car. The seizure I'd had at work was a direct result of missing doses over the past few weeks. Officer Penn asked if Craig would have known this was dangerous, and Dr. Cooper said anyone with internet access could find that information in 5 minutes. He pulled out his phone and showed her medical websites explaining epilepsy medication withdrawal. Officer Penn thanked him and wrote more notes. A hospital social worker knocked on the door next. He introduced himself as Winston and said he needed to do an assessment. I felt my face get hot because I knew what kind of assessment he meant. Winston pulled up another chair and started asking questions about my relationship with Craig. He asked if Craig controlled our finances or told me who I could see. I said no, not really. But then I remembered how Craig had complained when I went out with friends from work. Winston asked if Craig ever isolated me from family, and I explained that my parents lived in another state, so we didn't see them often anyway. He asked about the medication hiding, and I went through the whole story again. Winston listened without interrupting and took notes on a tablet. When I finished, he asked if I felt safe going home. I didn't know how to answer that. Craig had never hit me or threatened me physically. Winston explained that medical abuse was a real form of domestic violence where partners sabotaged treatment to maintain control. He said hiding life-saving medication fit a pattern he'd seen before with other patients. I started crying because hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real. Winston handed me tissues and waited until I calmed down. Officer Penn came back into the room after Winston finished his questions. She stood at the foot of my bed and her expression was serious. She said, based on my statement, Doctor Cooper's medical opinion and the evidence of prescription tampering, they were going to arrest Craig for reckless endangerment. She added that the prosecutor might also charge him with assault depending on how the investigation went. I started crying harder because part of me couldn't believe this was actually happening. My husband was going to be arrested. Officer Penn's voice got gentler and she explained that Dr. Cooper had a legal duty to report suspected abuse. She said this was a criminal matter now regardless of what I wanted. I asked if I could talk to Craig first, and Officer Penn shook her head. She said Craig was being held in another part of the hospital by security, and I shouldn't have contact with him. Winston added that it was normal to feel conflicted about this. He said many abuse victims struggle with guilt, even when they know they were harmed. The ER doctor came back to tell me they wanted to keep me overnight for observation because of my head injury. I nodded and asked if someone could bring me my phone from my locker at work. A nurse said she'd call the radiology department and arrange it. Officer Penn said she'd be in touch about next steps and left to process Craig's arrest. Winston gave me his card and said to call if I needed anything. After everyone left, I lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling. My head hurt and I felt exhausted but couldn't sleep. Around 8 that evening, Jen from work knocked on my door. She was still wearing her scrubs from her shift. She pulled a chair next to my bed and took my hand. I started crying again, and she just held my hand without saying anything for a while. When I finally stopped, Jen told me she'd known something was wrong the past few months. She said I'd been anxious and jumpy at work, always checking my phone like I was worried about something. I'd also started keeping my medication in my locker instead of taking it at home like I used to. Jen said she'd wanted to ask what was going on, but didn't want to pry. I told her I wished she had asked. We sat together for almost 2 hours, and she didn't leave until visiting hours ended. A nurse came in around 10 and said Craig had tried to come back to my room. Security had stopped him at the door when he claimed he needed to apologize. The nurse asked if I wanted them to call the police if he tried again, and I said yes. She made a note in my chart and checked my vital signs. After she left, I felt relieved and guilty at the same time. Winston had said that was normal for abuse victims, but it didn't make the feeling go away. I kept thinking about Craig sitting in a police car or a holding cell somewhere. I wondered if his mother knew yet. I wondered what he was telling people about why he got arrested. The nurse came back with a sleeping pill and I took it gratefully. Dr. Cooper returned early the next morning before I was discharged. He checked the bump on my head and looked at my eyes with a small light. He asked how I was feeling and I said, tired but okay. Dr. Cooper sat down and pulled out a prescription pad. He said he was adjusting my medication schedule to get my levels stable again. He wrote out very specific instructions about timing and dosage. Then he made me promise to fill the prescription immediately at the hospital pharmacy downstairs, where Craig couldn't interfere. I promised. Dr. Cooper also wrote a detailed letter documenting everything that had happened with my medication. He said the police would need it for their investigation. He put the letter in an envelope and sealed it. Before he left, he squeezed my shoulder and said he was glad I'd told the truth about what Craig had been doing. Winston stopped by again before lunch. He brought me pamphlets about a crisis counseling center and information about a domestic violence advocate who could help with the legal process. He sat down and explained very gently that what Craig did wasn't just being misguided or overly concerned. It was systematic sabotage of life-saving treatment. Winston said Craig had researched my condition, learned what would happen if I stopped taking medication, and then deliberately hidden my pills while watching for the results. That wasn't concern, it was abuse. I understood what he was saying intellectually, but it still felt surreal. My marriage had turned into something requiring police and social workers. Winston said that feeling of unreality was normal and would take time to process. He told me to call the counseling center within the next few days. They discharged me that afternoon with instructions to rest and follow up with Dr. Cooper in a week. I took a taxi home to our apartment because I didn't have my car. Walking through the front door felt wrong. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt safe anymore. I went straight to the kitchen and opened the freezer. My medication bottles were still there behind the frozen vegetables where I'd found them before. I pulled them out and lined them up on the counter. Then I started searching the apartment. I found bottles behind books on the living room shelf. I found bottles in the garage behind paint cans. I found bottles in the crawl space under the bathroom sink. Craig had been moving them to different spots every few days like some twisted scavenger hunt. I counted 14 bottles total. Some of them expired because he'd hidden them months ago. I sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by pill bottles and cried. My phone rang around 3 that afternoon. The caller ID said it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man introduced himself as Detective Drew McCarthy. He said he was assigned to investigate my case and needed to schedule a formal interview. His voice was professional and calm. He explained they were building a case for reckless endangerment and possibly additional charges depending on what the investigation uncovered. I asked what kind of additional charges, and he said they were looking at coercion and criminal mischief related to the prescription cancellation. Detective McCarthy asked about the incident at the pharmacy 6 months ago, when Craig had called pretending to be me. His voice got harder when I described it, and I could hear anger underneath the professional tone. He said someone from his office would call to set up an interview time and thanked me for my cooperation. I stayed home the next day because I couldn't face going back to work yet. My phone started ringing around 10 in the morning from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. By noon I had 7 missed calls, all from different numbers. I finally listened to the voicemails and they were all from Craig. He must have been calling from his mother's phone, his brother's phone, whoever would let him use theirs. His voice in the first message sounded panicked, saying this was all a huge misunderstanding and the doctor had overreacted. The second message he was apologizing, saying he knew he'd made mistakes but he loved me and just wanted to help. By the third message he was back to insisting he'd been trying to wean me off unnecessary medication, and I needed to understand his perspective. The fourth message said I was manipulated by doctors who profited from keeping me sick. I deleted the rest without listening. The calls kept coming all afternoon from new numbers. I turned my phone off. Karen called my work number the next morning. I was stupid enough to answer because I thought it might be about scheduling. She started crying immediately, asking how I could do this to her son. Her voice was high and shaking. She said Craig told her I'd had him arrested for trying to stage an intervention about my pill addiction. I tried to explain that I had epilepsy, that I'd had a seizure because Craig hid my medication, that I could have died. She talked right over me saying I'd always been defensive about my drug problem, and now I was trying to destroy Craig's life because he tried to help. I told her I wasn't addicted. I had a medical condition. She said that's what all addicts say, and she was praying for me to admit I had a problem. I hung up on her. My hands were shaking so hard I knocked my coffee over. Detective McCarthy called that afternoon and asked me to come to the police station to give a formal statement. I drove there after work, and he met me in a small interview room with a recording device on the table. He was maybe 40 with gray at his temples and tired eyes. He asked me to walk him through everything that had happened with Craig and my medication, starting from the beginning. I told him about the supplements, the moved pill bottles, the canceled prescription, the freezer incident. He took notes and asked specific questions about dates and times. When did Craig first suggest I didn't need medication? When did he start hiding the pills? How many times did he move them? What exactly did he say when I confronted him? I answered everything as clearly as I could, but some of the timeline blurred together because it had been going on for months. McCarthy asked about Craig telling his family I was an addict. I explained about Karen's calls and Tyler asking about interventions and how Craig kept reinforcing the addiction narrative even after I explained about my epilepsy. McCarthy's jaw clenched when I said that. He wrote something down, pressing his pen so hard I heard the paper tear slightly. McCarthy left the room for a few minutes and came back with a folder. He sat down and opened it, turning it so I could see printouts of web searches. He said they'd gotten a warrant for Craig's laptop and pulled his internet history. The searches made my stomach drop. Epilepsy medication withdrawal symptoms. How long before seizure without medication? Seizure triggers and warning signs. Can you die from epilepsy seizure? The dates on the searches went back 4 months. McCarthy said this showed Craig had researched what would happen if I stopped taking my pills, then deliberately hidden them while monitoring for results. That wasn't concern or misguided help. That was premeditation. The charge was upgraded from reckless endangerment to something more serious, possibly assault with intent to cause bodily harm. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Seeing it laid out like that, the evidence that Craig had planned this, had researched how to make me have a seizure. McCarthy asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't. I met with Paisley Gilbert 3 days later at the domestic violence legal clinic Winston had told me about. Her office was small but organized, files stacked neatly on metal shelves. She was maybe 50 with short gray hair and no-nonsense glasses. She asked me to tell her everything and I went through the whole story again. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. then said very directly that I needed a restraining order immediately. Craig's behavior was escalating. He'd shown he was willing to cause me serious physical harm, and the evidence indicated deliberate intent. She pulled out paperwork and started filling it in, asking me questions about addresses and phone numbers. I felt sick signing my name at the bottom, officially accusing my husband of abuse in legal documents. But Paisley said I couldn't go back to our apartment while Craig had access to it. She filed the paperwork that afternoon, and the hearing was scheduled for the following week. The restraining order hearing was in a small courtroom with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Craig sat on the other side with his lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit. Craig looked hurt and confused, like he couldn't understand why everyone was treating him like a criminal. The judge was a woman in her 60s who read through the petition with no expression. She asked me to explain what had happened. I stood up and described finding my medication in the freezer, going to work without my dose, having the seizure. My voice shook when I talked about waking up in the emergency room with a head injury. The judge's face got harder as I spoke. When I finished, she asked Craig's lawyer if he had any questions. He stood up and started to speak, but the judge granted the restraining order before he could finish his first sentence. She said the evidence was clear, and the order would remain in effect pending the criminal trial. Craig's lawyer tried to argue that this was a misunderstanding between spouses about medical treatment. He said Craig had been acting out of concern for my well-being and trying to help me reduce my dependence on pharmaceutical drugs. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. She said deliberately, hiding life-saving medication after researching withdrawal seizures didn't suggest concern. It suggested intent to harm. She asked Craig directly if he understood that epilepsy medication prevents potentially fatal seizures. Craig started to stand up, his face going red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back down into his chair. The judge said the restraining order was granted with a minimum distance of 500 feet, and Craig was not to contact me directly or through third parties. Court was dismissed. I couldn't afford our apartment on just my salary, so Jen offered to let me stay with her temporarily. She had a 2-bedroom place about 20 minutes from the hospital and cleared out her spare room, moving boxes into her garage to make space for me. We went to the apartment while Craig was at work to pack my essential stuff. I threw clothes into garbage bags and grabbed my toiletries from the bathroom. In the bedroom closet, I found 3 more bottles of my medication hidden behind shoe boxes. In the kitchen, I found 2 bottles behind the cereal boxes. We kept searching and found bottles everywhere. Some of them expired because Craig had hidden them months ago and I'd gotten new prescriptions. Jen's face got paler with each bottle we found. She asked how I'd lived like this, and I didn't have an answer. We loaded everything into her car and left before Craig got home. My supervisor called me into her office 2 days later. She said she was sympathetic about what I was going through, but concerned about the situation becoming known around the department. Other staff had seen Karen making a scene in the lobby. There were questions about why I'd been out on medical leave. She worried about workplace drama affecting patient care and team morale. I could tell she was trying to be kind, but also protect the department from gossip and problems. She asked if I needed more time off. I said no, I needed to work. I needed the routine and the income. She nodded, but I felt ashamed sitting there, like my personal crisis was an inconvenience for everyone else, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Tyler called me that evening. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He said he wanted to apologize. After Craig got arrested, he'd looked up epilepsy online and read about seizure disorders and medication management. He realized Craig had been completely wrong about everything. He said he felt terrible for asking me about interventions and not questioning Craig's addiction story more carefully. Then he told me Karen had been calling extended family members, trying to get them to pressure me into dropping the criminal charges. She was telling everyone I was vindictive and trying to ruin Craig's life over a misunderstanding. Tyler said he'd told her to stop, but she wasn't listening to anyone. She believed Craig's version where he was trying to save me from pharmaceutical dependency, and I was too addicted to see it. I thanked Tyler for calling and for believing me now. After we hung up, I sat on Jen's couch and cried because at least one person in Craig's family finally understood the truth. Detective McCarthy called 3 days later while I was stacking inventory in the supply room at work. I almost didn't answer because I was balancing boxes of contrast dye and didn't want to drop anything expensive. He told me the pharmacy had provided detailed records of Craig's call requesting treatment cancellation. They had timestamps, call duration, even notes about how Craig claimed to be acting on my behalf as my husband. The detective said they were adding charges of coercion and criminal mischief on top of the reckless endangerment. I sat down on a box because my legs felt wobbly. McCarthy asked if I was okay, and I said yes, but my hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone. He emailed me a copy of the police report, and I read it during my lunch break in my car. Seeing everything written out in official language made it feel more real somehow. The report documented every incident I'd told them about, the hidden medications, the canceled prescription, Craig's internet searches about seizure withdrawal. Reading the words, "suspect deliberately endangered victim's life through systematic medication interference," made my stomach hurt. I'd been living with this for months, but somehow the formal documentation made it more horrifying than when it was just happening to me. Winston had recommended a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse, and I finally called her office that week. The receptionist got me an appointment for the next day, which seemed impossibly fast, but she said they prioritized emergency referrals. The therapist's name was Dr. Reeves, and her office was in a converted house near the hospital with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. I sat down and she asked me to tell her what brought me in. I opened my mouth to explain and just started crying instead. She handed me a tissue box and waited quietly while I cried for probably 10 minutes straight. When I finally stopped, she asked gentle questions about Craig and the medication tampering. I kept apologizing for crying, and she told me to stop apologizing, that crying was a completely normal response to abuse. I said it wasn't really abuse, though, because he never hit me or yelled at me. Doctor. Reeves leaned forward and said medication tampering was absolutely abuse. She explained that what Craig did was a form of control designed to make me dependent on him and doubt my own judgment about my health needs. He wanted me to question whether I really needed the medication, so I'd rely on his opinion instead of my doctor's. The more she talked, the more I realized how calculated his behavior had been. It wasn't misguided concern, it was systematic manipulation. By the end of the session, I felt exhausted, but also like someone finally understood what had happened to me. I was doing paperwork at the radiology desk 2 days later when the receptionist called security. I looked up and saw Karen in the lobby trying to push past the front desk staff. She was demanding to see me and saying she had a right to talk to her daughter-in-law. The security guard approached her calmly, but she started raising her voice about how I was destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding. Other people in the waiting room were staring, and some were recording on their phones. I ducked behind the desk hoping she wouldn't see me, but one of the other techs pointed in my direction. Karen started walking toward the radiology department entrance, and the security guard had to physically block her path. She was yelling now about how I needed to drop the charges and stop being vindictive. The guard called for backup, and another security officer arrived to help escort her out. Karen was still shouting as they walked her to the exit, saying I was tearing their family apart and Craig had only been trying to help me. My coworkers stood frozen watching the whole scene unfold. After security got her outside, I went to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall. My whole body was shaking and I felt like I might throw up. When I came back out, everyone was whispering and staring at me. Suddenly, my personal crisis wasn't private anymore. Everyone at work knew my business. The next few days at work were miserable. Some coworkers were supportive and asked if I was okay or needed anything, but others started avoiding me in the break room. I'd walk in and conversations would stop abruptly. People would find reasons to leave when I sat down. On Thursday, I was restocking supplies in the MRI prep area and overheard 2 techs talking in the hallway. One of them said I must have done something to provoke Craig if he went that far. The other one agreed and said there were always 2 sides to every story. They wondered if maybe I really did have a pill problem and was making Craig look bad to cover it up. I stood there frozen behind the door holding a box of sterile gloves. They kept talking about how Craig seemed like such a nice guy when he'd visited me at work before. Maybe I was exaggerating what happened or playing victim for attention. I waited until they left before coming out of the prep room. The isolation at work made everything so much harder, because the hospital used to feel like a safe professional space where I was respected and competent. Now I felt like people were judging me and questioning my version of events. I started eating lunch in my car to avoid the break room entirely. Paisley called me that Friday to say she was filing divorce papers on my behalf. She'd prepared everything citing abuse and irreconcilable differences. I signed the papers at her office feeling numb. She explained Craig would be served within a few days and would have time to respond. I asked if he could contest it, and she said yes. But given the criminal charges and restraining order, most judges would grant the divorce quickly. 2 weeks later, Paisley called saying Craig had contested the filing. His lawyer sent a response letter claiming I was mentally unstable due to my epilepsy medication. The letter said I was making false accusations against Craig because the medication affected my judgment and perception of reality. It said I needed psychiatric evaluation before any divorce proceedings continued. Paisley read me parts of the letter over the phone and I felt sick. Seeing those words about myself, that I was mentally unstable and couldn't be trusted to know what happened to me, made me feel crazy. Paisley assured me this was a standard intimidation tactic that abusers used. She said Craig's lawyer was trying to make me doubt myself and scare me into dropping everything. But reading those accusations still made me question whether I was overreacting or misremembering things. Maybe Craig really had been trying to help, and I was too dependent on medication to see it clearly. Paisley must have heard something in my voice because she firmly told me not to let his lawyer's words get in my head. She said we had medical records, police reports, and witness statements proving everything I'd said was true. Doctor. Cooper called Paisley directly after she contacted his office about Craig's claims. He spent an entire afternoon writing a detailed rebuttal letter explaining that my epilepsy medication didn't cause mental instability. The letter included years of medical records showing stable treatment and completely normal neurological exams. He documented every appointment, every blood test, every cognitive assessment I'd ever done. The records showed my brain function was normal, my memory was normal, my judgment was normal. Doctor. Cooper wrote that epilepsy medication stabilized brain activity. It didn't impair cognitive function. He explained that my medication levels had always been therapeutic and appropriate. The only time I'd shown any problems was when Craig interfered with my medication access, causing the seizure and head injury. Paisley called me after receiving the letter and said it completely destroyed Craig's argument before it could gain any traction. She sounded excited, saying no judge would question my competency after reading Dr. Cooper's documentation. I felt grateful but also sad that my own doctor had to spend hours defending my sanity because my husband was trying to paint me as unstable. The prosecutor handling Craig's criminal case wanted to meet with me about testimony. Her office was downtown in a building that smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She introduced herself and explained they were pursuing felony reckless endangerment because Craig's actions created substantial risk of death or serious injury. When she said the words substantial risk of death out loud, I had to excuse myself. I barely made it to her office bathroom before throwing up. She knocked on the door asking if I was okay, and I said yes, but I wasn't. I washed my face and came back out. She was kind about it and said most victims had strong reactions to hearing the charges formally stated. We spent 2 hours going over my potential testimony. She asked detailed questions about every medication incident, every conversation with Craig, every time I'd felt unsafe. She wanted me to be prepared for Craig's lawyer to cross-examine me aggressively. He would try to make me look unreliable or suggest I was exaggerating. She said to stay calm and stick to facts. By the end of the meeting, my head was pounding and I felt exhausted. Driving home, I kept thinking about the phrase substantial risk of death and how close I'd come to not surviving Craig's help. Our mutual friends started reaching out with messages from Craig. He was asking them to tell me he was sorry and wanted to go to couples counseling together. He said we could work through this if I'd just talk to him. One friend texted saying Craig seemed really remorseful, and maybe I brought the messages to my therapy session, and Dr. Reeves got very serious. She warned me this was a common abuse tactic. Abusers often try to use counseling as another way to manipulate and control their victims. She said counseling with an abuser was dangerous because they manipulate the therapeutic process to make themselves look reasonable while further gaslighting the victim. A good therapist wouldn't even agree to couples counseling in cases of abuse. They'd refer each person to individual therapy instead. Dr. Reeves told me firmly not to have any contact with Craig, not even through friends. I texted everyone back saying I couldn't have contact with Craig and needed them to respect that boundary. Some friends understood, but others stopped talking to me entirely. One friend responded saying I was being dramatic and destroying a marriage over a disagreement about medication. Another said I should be more forgiving since Craig was trying to make amends. Losing friends hurt almost as much as losing my marriage because I realized they'd never really understood what Craig did to me. My follow-up appointment with Dr. Cooper came exactly 1 month after the hospital seizure. He checked my medication levels and they were finally stable again. I hadn't had any breakthrough seizures since being released from the hospital. He seemed pleased with my progress and said we'd continue monitoring closely. But then he asked about my medication routine, and I had to admit I'd developed serious anxiety around it. I was checking and rechecking that I'd taken my pills multiple times a day. I kept the bottles with me constantly. In my purse, in my car, next to my bed. I'd wake up in the middle of the night panicking that someone had hidden them. Sometimes I'd check the bottle 6 or 7 times in an hour to make sure the pills were still there. Dr. Cooper listened quietly and said this hypervigilance was a trauma response. My brain was trying to protect me from the danger I'd experienced by staying constantly alert. He said it was completely understandable given what Craig had done, but I needed help managing it. He referred me to a psychiatrist who specialized in medical trauma. I felt embarrassed admitting how anxious I'd become, but Dr. Cooper assured me trauma responses were normal reactions to abnormal situations. He said getting help now would prevent the anxiety from getting worse or interfering with my treatment long term. My supervisor called me into her office the week after Karen's scene in the lobby. She closed the door and asked me to sit down. She said the hospital administration was concerned about the incident and its impact on workplace environment. Some staff had complained about feeling uncomfortable with the drama. There were worries about what would happen if Karen came back, or if other family members showed up. My supervisor said they needed to put me on modified duty temporarily while things settled down. Modified duty meant working in the file room organizing records instead of doing patient scans. It meant being away from the department I loved and the work I was good at. She kept saying it was temporary and for everyone's safety, but I knew what it really meant. The administrators were worried about liability if I had another seizure at work. They were worried about more scenes with Craig's family disrupting operations. I was demoted because my personal crisis was inconvenient for the hospital. I said I understood even though I wanted to scream. My supervisor looked relieved and said she appreciated my flexibility. Walking back to collect my things from the radiology department, I felt the demotion like a physical weight. I'd worked so hard to build my career and now I was filing papers in a basement office because my husband had tried to kill me, and his mother couldn't accept it. The file room became my prison for the next 2 weeks, sorting decade-old patient records in a windowless basement office that smelled like dust and forgotten paperwork. I kept my phone on my desk with the volume turned all the way up, checking it every few minutes even though nobody was calling. My coworkers from radiology stopped by the first few days with sympathetic looks and offers to grab me coffee, but those visits tapered off quickly. People didn't know what to say to someone whose husband tried to kill them by hiding their medication, so they stopped trying. I ate lunch alone at my desk instead of in the cafeteria where I might run into Karen again, or face more awkward questions from people who'd heard rumors but didn't know the full story. Detective McCarthy called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was alphabetizing files from 2015. He asked if I could come down to the station because he had some things to show me about the investigation. I left work early and drove to the police station with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. McCarthy met me in a small conference room with folders spread across the table and his laptop open to what looked like spreadsheets. He explained they'd executed a search warrant on Craig's computer and phone as part of the criminal investigation. What they found was worse than I'd imagined. Craig's YouTube watch history went back 18 months and contained hundreds of hours of alternative medicine content. McCarthy clicked through screenshots showing video after video about pharmaceutical conspiracies, natural healing, and people claiming they'd cured themselves of various conditions by rejecting Western medicine. There were channels dedicated entirely to epilepsy, with titles like "Big Pharma Doesn't Want You to Know This," and "I Cured My Seizures Without Drugs." The comment sections were full of people saying medication was poison, that doctors were keeping patients sick for profit, that anyone taking pills was brainwashed. McCarthy showed me Craig's search history too. Epilepsy medication side effects. How long before seizure without medication? Epilepsy medication withdrawal timeline. Can you die from epilepsy seizure? The searches painted a picture of someone researching exactly what would happen if I stopped taking my pills. McCarthy said this evidence showed premeditation, that Craig hadn't just been misguided but had actively researched the consequences of interfering with my treatment. I sat there staring at the screen feeling sick, because this meant Craig knew. He knew I could have a seizure. He knew it could be dangerous. He did it anyway because some YouTube conspiracy theorist convinced him medication was worse than the disease. Seeing it all documented like this helped me understand how Craig got radicalized into these beliefs, but it didn't make it hurt less. The man I married had spent months watching videos that told him I didn't really need my medication, and he'd believed strangers on the internet over my doctors and over me. I drove home to Jen's apartment in a daze and found a voicemail from Tyler waiting on my phone. He said he needed to talk to me about something important regarding Craig's case. I called him back and he answered on the first ring. Tyler said he'd been thinking about everything that happened, and he wanted to testify on my behalf if it would help. He told me Craig had tried to convince him to stop taking his blood pressure medication last year, saying it was a scam and that pharmaceutical companies just wanted to keep people dependent on pills. Tyler had laughed it off at the time because he figured Craig was just going through a weird phase with the wellness stuff, but now he realized how serious Craig's beliefs had become. Tyler said he felt guilty for not taking it more seriously when Craig was spouting that nonsense, that maybe if he'd pushed back harder, Craig wouldn't have gone after my medication. I told Tyler it wasn't his fault and thanked him for offering to testify. His support meant a lot, especially coming from Craig's own brother. But it also made me realize Craig's dangerous beliefs extended beyond just me. He'd tried to talk his brother out of taking necessary medication too. How many other people had Craig tried to influence with his anti-medication crusade? I wondered if he'd bothered any of our friends or his coworkers with his theories about big pharma conspiracies. Tyler promised to reach out to the detective and the prosecutor to offer his testimony. He said he wanted to make sure everyone understood this wasn't just about me, that Craig had a pattern of trying to interfere with people's medical treatment. The divorce proceedings started moving forward and Paisley filed the initial paperwork. Craig contested everything immediately and hired a lawyer who seemed determined to make the process as difficult as possible. 2 weeks after the initial filing, Paisley called me furious because Craig's lawyer had subpoenaed my medical records. They were trying to prove I'd been non-compliant with my treatment, suggesting I'd missed doses on my own, and was now blaming Craig to avoid taking responsibility. Paisley filed an emergency motion to block the subpoena, arguing that the criminal case had already established Craig's interference, and my medical records were protected. We had a hearing in front of the judge who'd granted my restraining order. She looked annoyed when Craig's lawyer tried to argue that my medical history was relevant to the divorce proceedings. The judge denied the subpoena request, stating flatly that the criminal investigation had documented extensive evidence of Craig tampering with my medication, and there was no basis for questioning my compliance. Craig sat across the courtroom glaring at me like I was the one who'd betrayed him, like I'd done something wrong by reporting what he did. His expression reminded me of all the times he'd accused me of being dramatic or close-minded when I refused to stop taking my medication. Even now, facing criminal charges and divorce, he still seemed to think he was the victim in this situation. Paisley whispered that the judge's ruling was a good sign for the divorce proceedings, that Craig's lawyer was grasping at straws. I just wanted it to be over, so I could stop sitting in courtrooms looking at my husband's face. That night, I got home from the hearing and found a long email from Karen in my inbox. The subject line said, "Please read with an open heart." I almost deleted it without opening, but something made me click. Karen had written several paragraphs about how I was tearing the family apart and destroying Craig's life over a mistake. She said Craig had made an error in judgment, but didn't deserve to have his whole future ruined because of it. The email included Bible verses about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. Karen wrote that I was being vindictive by pursuing criminal charges instead of handling this privately as a family matter. She said Craig had learned his lesson and would never do anything like this again if I would just drop the charges and work on our marriage. The email made my blood boil because it showed Karen still didn't understand what Craig had done. This wasn't a mistake or an error in judgment. Craig had systematically hidden my medication for months, researched seizure withdrawal, canceled my prescriptions, and put my life in danger. But Karen framed it like Craig had forgotten to take out the trash or said something rude at dinner. I wanted to respond and explain for the 100th time that Craig had nearly killed me, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Karen had decided her son was the victim, and nothing I said would change her mind. Instead, I saved the email in a folder because Paisley had told me to document any contact from Craig's family. She said if the harassment continued, we might need to expand the restraining order to include Karen. My first appointment with the psychiatrist that Dr. Cooper referred me to happened on a Wednesday morning before my shift in the file room. The psychiatrist asked detailed questions about my anxiety around medication and my constant checking behaviors. I told her about waking up multiple times at night to make sure my pills were still there, about keeping the bottles in my purse at all times, about checking them 6 or 7 times an hour to confirm nobody had moved them. She listened and took notes, and then told me I had PTSD related to the medication tampering and medical endangerment. She explained that my anxiety and hypervigilance were classic trauma responses, that my brain was trying to protect me from danger by staying constantly alert. The diagnosis felt both validating and devastating. Validating because it confirmed my reactions were normal given what I'd experienced, but devastating because it meant Craig had damaged me in ways that wouldn't easily heal. The psychiatrist recommended starting trauma therapy in addition to my regular counseling sessions. She prescribed medication for the anxiety, but I had a panic attack in her office about taking another new pill, terrified someone would tamper with it or tell me I didn't really need it. She was patient and understanding, explaining that my fear was part of the trauma response. We agreed I'd start with a low dose and keep the medication at work in my locker where I knew it was safe. Starting trauma therapy felt like admitting Craig had broken something fundamental in me, that I couldn't just move on and forget what happened. The psychiatrist assured me trauma responses were normal reactions to abnormal situations, and that getting help now would prevent things from getting worse. Jen found me crying on her couch that night after the psychiatry appointment. She sat down next to me and said I could stay with her as long as I needed, that she didn't mind having a roommate. I appreciated her kindness, but I knew I needed to start rebuilding my independence instead of relying on her generosity indefinitely. I started looking at apartments online, searching for studios or one-bedrooms I could afford on my radiology tech salary. The financial stress overwhelmed me immediately. I was paying Paisley for the divorce lawyer, paying the psychiatrist and the trauma therapist, trying to save for first and last month's rent plus a security deposit. My paycheck barely covered it all, even without rent. I picked up extra shifts in the file room despite my supervisor's concerns about me working too much. She pulled me aside and said she was worried I was burning myself out, but I explained I needed the money for legal fees and therapy. She looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. I spent my evenings scrolling through apartment listings and doing the math over and over, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. Some nights I'd lie awake in Jen's spare room panicking about money and wondering if I should just give up and move back to my parents' house 3 states away. But that felt like letting Craig win, like admitting I couldn't handle things on my own. The prosecutor called me 3 weeks after the initial charges were filed. She said Craig had violated the restraining order by trying to contact me multiple times through mutual friends and family members. He'd asked friends to tell me he was sorry and wanted to talk. He'd had his mother email me. He'd even tried to get Tyler to convince me to drop the charges. The prosecutor explained that these attempts to influence my testimony or convince me to drop charges violated the restraining order conditions and constituted witness tampering. She was filing additional charges and requesting Craig's bail be revoked. I felt a weird mix of relief and guilt. Relief because it meant Craig would face more consequences for not leaving me alone, but guilt because I knew his parents would blame me for him going to jail. The prosecutor assured me I hadn't done anything wrong, that Craig made his own choices to violate the court order. 2 days later, Craig spent his first night in jail after the judge revoked his bail at an emergency hearing. He stayed there for 2 weeks while his parents scrambled to come up with money for a higher bond. Karen left me an angry voicemail saying this was my fault for being unforgiving and vindictive. I saved that voicemail too for Paisley's harassment folder. The grand jury testimony happened on a cold morning in early November. The prosecutor prepared me the day before, explaining what questions she'd ask and what the grand jury process involved. She said this was just to get an indictment, that the real trial would come later if Craig didn't take a plea deal. I sat in a room full of strangers and told them everything. The medication hiding, the prescription cancellation, the freezer incident, the seizure at work, the head injury. I showed them photos of the bruise on my head from hitting the MRI machine. The prosecutor asked me to describe finding multiple medication bottles hidden around the house after Craig's arrest. The grand jury members looked horrified as I talked, especially when the prosecutor showed them Craig's search history about seizure withdrawal. One woman on the jury had tears in her eyes. The whole testimony took about an hour, and when I finished, the prosecutor walked me out and said I'd done great. 3 days later, she called to tell me the grand jury had indicted Craig on felony charges including reckless endangerment, coercion, and criminal mischief. She said this was a strong case because of the documented search history and the prescription interference, but she also warned me trials were unpredictable. She said Craig's lawyer would probably try to negotiate a plea deal, and I should prepare for that possibility. I wasn't sure how I felt about a plea deal. Part of me wanted Craig to face a full trial and have everything he did exposed publicly, but another part just wanted this over so I could move on with my life. Craig's lawyer contacted Paisley 2 weeks after the indictment. He proposed a plea agreement where Craig would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation and mandatory counseling instead of jail time. The prosecutor called me to discuss it and said the decision was ultimately mine. She could push for a trial if that's what I wanted, but plea deals were common and would resolve things faster with less trauma. I told her I needed time to think about it. That night in therapy, I broke down trying to figure out what outcome I could live with. My therapist helped me work through my conflicting feelings. I wanted Craig to face serious consequences for nearly killing me, but I also wanted to stop thinking about him every day. A trial meant months more of court dates and testimony and seeing his face. A plea deal meant it would be over sooner, but Craig might get off easier than he deserved. My therapist said there was no wrong answer, that I needed to decide what would help me heal and move forward. She reminded me that Craig would still have a felony conviction on his record either way, that probation and mandatory counseling were real consequences even if they weren't jail time. I spent days agonizing over the decision, making lists of pros and cons, talking it through with Jen and Paisley. Finally, I told the prosecutor I'd accept the plea deal if it included a long probation period, extensive counseling requirements, and a permanent restraining order. She said she'd negotiate those terms with Craig's lawyer. The pretrial hearing happened before the plea deal was finalized. Dr. Cooper had to testify about the medical dangers of epilepsy medication withdrawal. I sat in the courtroom listening to him explain to the judge how abrupt discontinuation of anti-seizure medication could cause status epilepticus, a continuous seizure state that could result in brain damage or death. He described how my medication levels had been dangerously low when I came into the emergency room, how the seizure could have killed me if I'd been driving or in a different situation. He talked about the head injury and how much worse it could have been. Hearing him describe what could have happened to me made the courtroom spin. I'd known intellectually that hiding my medication was dangerous, but hearing a doctor explain the specific ways I could have died or been permanently brain damaged made it real in a new way. Craig sat at the defense table looking down at his hands while Dr. Cooper testified. His lawyer tried to argue that Craig didn't understand the severity of the risks, but Dr. Cooper calmly pointed out that Craig's search history showed he'd researched seizure withdrawal and its dangers. The judge looked disgusted when the lawyer kept trying to minimize what Craig had done. After Dr. Cooper's testimony, the prosecutor and defense lawyer went into chambers to discuss the plea agreement terms. I waited in the hallway with Paisley, trying not to throw up. They came back out 20 minutes later, and the prosecutor motioned for me to join them in a small conference room down the hall. She laid out the terms Craig's lawyer was offering. He'd plead guilty to reckless endangerment and coercion, 2 felonies, in exchange for 3 years probation with strict conditions. Mandatory domestic violence counseling twice a week for the entire probation period. Random drug testing even though drugs weren't involved, just to establish a pattern of compliance. A permanent restraining order that would follow him even after probation ended. Community service working with organizations that supported chronic illness patients, which felt weirdly appropriate. And he'd have to pay my legal fees for both the criminal case and the divorce. The prosecutor said this was a strong deal because it guaranteed consequences without putting me through a trial. She explained that trials were unpredictable, and juries sometimes sympathized with defendants who claimed good intentions. With a plea deal, Craig would have a felony record that would show up on every background check for the rest of his life. He'd never be able to work in healthcare or education or any field requiring trust. His probation officer would monitor him closely, and any violation would send him straight to jail to serve the original sentence. I asked what the original sentence would have been if we went to trial and won. She said probably 2 to 4 years in prison, but there was always the risk of losing and Craig walking away with nothing. I felt sick thinking about him facing no consequences at all. Paisley squeezed my shoulder and reminded me that probation and mandatory counseling were real punishment, that Craig would spend 3 years under constant supervision and scrutiny. The prosecutor added that the permanent restraining order was huge, because it meant Craig could never contact me again for any reason without facing immediate arrest. I sat there staring at the plea agreement paperwork trying to decide if I could live with this outcome. Part of me wanted Craig locked up where he couldn't hurt anyone else. But another part of me just wanted it over so I could start rebuilding my life without court dates and testimony hanging over me. I asked for a few hours to think about it, and the prosecutor said that was fine. Craig's lawyer had given them until the end of business day to respond. Paisley drove me back to Jen's apartment, and I spent the afternoon pacing around the living room trying to figure out what I wanted. Jen made me tea and listened while I talked through all my conflicting feelings. I was angry that Craig might avoid prison. I was relieved I wouldn't have to testify in front of a jury and relive everything in excruciating detail. I was scared that probation wasn't enough to keep him from doing this to someone else. I was exhausted from months of legal proceedings and just wanted my life back. Jen pointed out that 3 years of supervised probation with mandatory counseling meant Craig would face consequences every single week, that it wasn't like he was getting off easy. I called my therapist and she helped me work through the decision. She reminded me that I needed to choose what would help me heal and move forward, not what would punish Craig the most. She said both outcomes had validity and there was no wrong answer. I thought about sitting in a courtroom for days or weeks, listening to Craig's lawyer try to paint me as unstable or dramatic. I thought about Craig's family testifying about what a good person he was and how he'd just made a mistake. I thought about the jury seeing my medical records and my whole life exposed for strangers to judge. Then I thought about signing the plea agreement and being done with the criminal case within a few weeks. I called the prosecutor back that evening and told her I'd accept the plea deal with the terms she outlined. She said she'd notify Craig's lawyer and schedule the plea hearing for the following week. I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed, like I'd made the practical choice but not the satisfying one. The plea hearing happened on a Tuesday morning at the courthouse downtown. I sat in the gallery with Paisley while Craig stood before the judge with his lawyer. The prosecutor read the charges and the terms of the agreement into the record. Craig had to state out loud that he was pleading guilty to reckless endangerment and coercion, that he understood he was admitting to deliberately interfering with my medication and causing me serious harm. His voice was quiet, and I couldn't read his expression from where I sat. The judge asked him several questions to make sure he understood what he was agreeing to. Did he understand these were felony convictions? Yes. Did he understand he'd be on probation for 3 years with strict conditions? Yes. Did he understand that any violation would result in immediate jail time? Yes. Did he understand the permanent restraining order meant he could never contact me again? Yes. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. That was it. Less than 20 minutes and the criminal case was essentially over. Craig's lawyer led him out through a side door and I didn't have to see him up close. Paisley said this was good, that the quick proceeding meant less stress for me. But I felt strangely hollow, like I'd expected something more dramatic or conclusive. The prosecutor caught up with us in the hallway and explained that sentencing would be when the judge formally imposed the probation terms, and I'd have a chance to give a victim impact statement if I wanted to. I told her I'd think about it. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon felt surreal. I'd been bracing myself for months of trial preparation and testimony, and suddenly it was mostly over. I went back to work that afternoon because sitting around Jen's apartment would have made me spiral. My coworkers could tell something had happened, but I didn't want to talk about it. I just focused on my scans and my patients, and tried to feel normal for a few hours. 3 weeks later, I was back at the courthouse for sentencing. This time I'd prepared a victim impact statement that my therapist had helped me write. I sat in the front row while the judge reviewed Craig's case file and the probation department's recommendations. Then she asked if I wanted to address the court. I stood up and my hands shook holding the paper I'd printed my statement on. I told the judge about 8 years of successful epilepsy management before Craig started interfering. I described the fear of not being able to find my medication and the humiliation of being called an addict by his family. I explained waking up in the emergency room with a head injury and learning I could have died. I talked about the ongoing anxiety around taking my medication now, the hypervigilance and the nightmares about seizures. I said I hoped the counseling would help Craig understand that what he did was abuse, not concern, and that interfering with someone's medical treatment could kill them. My voice cracked a few times, but I got through it. When I sat down, Paisley squeezed my hand. Craig's lawyer stood up and Craig read a statement he'd prepared. He said he was sorry for causing me harm and he'd been misguided in his beliefs about medication. He claimed he'd been trying to help me live a healthier life and never intended for me to get hurt. He said he'd learned from this experience and would complete all the counseling requirements. The judge let him finish, and then her expression went cold. She said intent didn't matter when someone deliberately hid life-saving medication and researched seizure withdrawal. She said Craig's internet search history showed he knew the dangers and proceeded anyway. She told him he was fortunate the seizure hadn't killed me or caused permanent brain damage, because then he'd be facing manslaughter charges instead of reckless endangerment. She imposed the 3 years probation with all the conditions from the plea agreement, emphasizing that any violation would result in immediate incarceration. She said the permanent restraining order would remain in effect for the rest of Craig's life, not just during probation. She told him that tampering with someone's medical treatment was one of the most dangerous forms of domestic abuse, and she hoped the counseling would help him understand the severity of what he'd done. Craig's face was red and he looked down at the table while she spoke. When the judge dismissed us, I felt this rush of validation hearing her describe Craig's actions as abuse and dangerous. It wasn't the prison sentence part of me had wanted, but it was something. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Paisley called to tell me the divorce was finalized. I didn't have to attend the final hearing because we'd already agreed on all the terms through our lawyers. I got to keep my car and all my personal belongings. Craig had to pay my legal fees for both the criminal case and the divorce, which came to almost $15,000. We didn't have much in terms of shared assets because we'd only been married 2 years, and most of our furniture came from his family. I didn't want any of it anyway. Paisley sent me the final decree by email, and I stared at it for a long time. Legally, I was no longer married to Craig. The worst chapter of my life was officially closed. I should have felt relieved or happy, but mostly I just felt tired. That night, I treated myself to takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and ate it alone in Jen's spare room. It felt like such a small, quiet ending to something that had consumed my entire life for months. A few days later, I got an email from Karen. The subject line said, "Praying for peace," and I almost deleted it without reading. But curiosity got the better of me. She wrote that she was praying for me to find peace and forgiveness, that holding on to anger would only hurt me in the long run. She said Craig had made mistakes, but he was still her son, and she hoped someday I could see that he'd been trying to help in his own misguided way. She included several Bible verses about forgiveness and letting go of bitterness. I read it twice and then deleted it without responding. My therapist had been working with me on setting boundaries and recognizing that I didn't owe anyone forgiveness I didn't feel. Karen wanted me to absolve Craig, so she could feel better about her son being a felon. That wasn't my responsibility. I didn't need to prioritize her comfort over my own healing. Deleting that email felt like taking back a small piece of power. Tyler called me a few weeks after the divorce was finalized. We'd stayed in occasional contact, and he'd been one of the few members of Craig's family who actually apologized and meant it. He told me Craig had moved to another state to live with a cousin. Apparently, Karen had been driving him crazy with her constant hovering and attempts to control his probation requirements. Craig needed distance from the family drama. Tyler said it almost like he expected me to have an opinion about it. I realized I felt absolutely nothing hearing this news. Craig moving away didn't make me happy or sad or relieved. He was just gone from my life, and that was fine. My therapist said later that the lack of emotional reaction was actually a good sign, that it meant I was detaching in a healthy way. Craig wasn't taking up space in my head anymore. 6 months after the seizure, I had my regular appointment with Dr. Cooper. I'd been seeing him every 3 months since the incident to monitor my medication levels and make sure everything stayed stable. He reviewed my latest blood work and said my levels were perfect. No breakthrough seizures, no concerning fluctuations, everything exactly where it should be. He leaned back in his chair and told me he was proud of how I'd advocated for myself by reporting the abuse. He said a lot of patients didn't survive partners who tampered with their medical treatment, that I'd been lucky the seizure happened at work where people could help me immediately. If it had happened while I was driving or in the shower or somewhere else alone, I might have died. His words hit me hard, even though I'd known intellectually how dangerous the situation had been. Hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I started crying in his office, and he handed me tissues and waited patiently while I pulled myself together. He said the important thing was that I was safe now and my epilepsy was well managed again. He adjusted my appointment schedule to every 6 months since I'd been so stable. Walking out of his office that day, I felt this weird mix of gratitude and grief. Grateful that I'd survived and had doctors who took the danger seriously. Grieving for the person I'd been before Craig's interference. Before I learned that someone who claimed to love me could put my life at risk. I found a support group for survivors of medical abuse through the crisis center Winston recommended. The first meeting, I walked into a community center basement and saw 8 other people sitting in a circle, and I almost turned around and left because admitting I needed this felt like admitting how broken I was. But the facilitator smiled and gestured to an empty chair, so I sat down. A woman named Sarah went first and talked about her ex-husband hiding her insulin and telling her she was being dramatic about her diabetes. Another person described a partner who threw out their inhaler during an asthma attack because they believed breathing exercises would work better. Someone else shared how their boyfriend sabotaged their antidepressants by replacing pills with vitamins, saying mental illness wasn't real. I listened to story after story of people whose partners had interfered with life-saving medication, and the pattern was always the same. Control disguised as concern. Gaslighting about medical necessity. Isolation from doctors and support systems. When it was my turn, I told them about the freezer incident and the seizure, and everyone nodded like they understood completely. No one looked shocked or asked what I'd done to provoke it. Sarah said her ex also researched withdrawal symptoms before hiding her insulin, just like Craig had researched seizure triggers. The facilitator explained that medical abuse was about power and control, not actually believing the partner didn't need medication. These abusers knew exactly how dangerous their actions were. Hearing other people's experiences made something click in my brain. Craig's behavior wasn't misguided love or wellness enthusiasm gone wrong. It was calculated abuse using my epilepsy as the weapon. I cried through most of that first meeting, but I kept going back every week. The group helped me stop making excuses for Craig in my head, and reinforced that what happened to me was serious and intentional. At work, things slowly got better as months passed and the drama faded into background noise. My coworkers saw me showing up every day, doing my job well, handling the legal stuff professionally without bringing it into the radiology department. The whispers in the break room stopped and people started treating me normally again instead of walking on eggshells. One afternoon, about 8 months after the seizure, a tech named Rachel approached me while I was reviewing scans. She'd been one of the people who avoided me after Karen's scene in the lobby. Rachel said she wanted to apologize for her reaction back then. She admitted she didn't understand domestic violence could look like medication tampering, and thought I must have been exaggerating or causing drama. But she'd done some reading after seeing how the situation played out, and she realized how wrong her assumptions were. Her honesty meant more to me than all the coworkers who just pretended nothing happened and never acknowledged their judgment. Rachel asked if we could grab coffee sometime, and I said yes. Having someone admit their ignorance and actually learn from it felt like real progress, not the fake politeness other people offered. We became friends after that, and she even came to a couple support group meetings as an ally. The coworkers who avoided the topic entirely or acted like my marriage just ended normally bothered me more than the ones who'd been openly weird about it. At least Rachel owned her mistake and grew from it. My therapist told me after a year of trauma work that I was ready to start dating again if I wanted to. The idea terrified me, but I also felt lonely and wanted to believe healthy relationships were possible. I joined a dating app and was upfront in my profile about having epilepsy and taking medication twice daily. On first dates, I paid close attention to how men reacted when I took my pills. Some guys didn't notice or comment at all, which was fine. Others asked thoughtful questions about my condition and treatment, which I appreciated. But one guy made a joke about Big Pharma making billions off people who probably didn't need pills, and I stood up and left the restaurant immediately. I didn't explain or give him a second chance. My tolerance for that mindset was completely gone, and I refused to waste time on anyone who showed even a hint of Craig's beliefs. Another date went well until the guy suggested I try a ketogenic diet, because he'd read it could cure epilepsy. I finished my drink, paid my half of the bill, and left. My therapist said this was healthy boundary setting, not being too picky. I was protecting myself by refusing to ignore red flags that used to seem small. Dating felt exhausting because I was hyper-aware of every comment about medication or doctors or alternative medicine. But I'd rather be single forever than end up with someone who might put my life at risk again. My psychiatrist reduced my PTSD therapy to twice monthly after 18 months because I was managing triggers much better. The hypervigilance around my medication had decreased significantly, though I still had moments of anxiety. Sometimes I'd check my pill bottles 3 or 4 times before bed, counting to make sure the right amount was missing for the day. Other times I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced someone had moved them, and I'd have to physically touch the bottles to calm down. But I was getting better at talking myself down from the panic without spiraling. My therapist taught me grounding techniques, and I used them when the obsessive checking started. Progress felt incredibly slow, like I was moving through mud, but my psychiatrist assured me I was healing at a normal pace for this type of trauma. She said medical abuse often took years to fully process because it violated such a basic trust. Your partner is supposed to help you stay alive, not research how to endanger you. Some weeks I felt fine and thought I was past it all. Other weeks, something would trigger me, like seeing a wellness podcast ad or someone mentioning YouTube health advice, and I'd be right back in that apartment hunting for my medication in the freezer. The therapy helped me understand these setbacks were part of recovery, not signs I was failing. The hospital administration contacted me about 9 months after the divorce, asking if I'd consult on new emergency department protocols. They wanted to develop screening questions for identifying patients who might be experiencing medical sabotage at home. I met with the head of the ER and a social work supervisor, and we worked together creating a list of questions staff could ask. Things like whether patients had consistent access to their medications, if anyone at home questioned their need for treatment, if prescriptions had been canceled without their knowledge. We added training for recognizing signs that a partner might be interfering with medical care. The hospital implemented the protocols and asked me to present at a staff training session. Standing in front of 50 medical professionals talking about my experience felt surreal and vulnerable, but several nurses came up afterwards saying they'd encountered patients with similar situations and hadn't known how to help. One doctor said the training would have helped him recognize my case sooner if he'd known what signs to look for. Turning my experience into something that might help other people felt meaningful without making it my whole identity. I was still a radiology tech who happened to survive medical abuse, not a victim defined by what Craig did. The consulting work gave me a sense of purpose, but I was careful not to let it consume me. My therapist helped me maintain boundaries around how much I shared and how involved I got in domestic violence advocacy. 14 months after the seizure, my supervisor called me into her office and I immediately felt anxious, thinking something was wrong. Instead, she told me I was promoted to senior radiology tech with a significant raise. She said my professionalism throughout the entire crisis demonstrated leadership, and my work on the domestic violence protocols showed initiative beyond my job description. The promotion came with supervisory responsibilities for evening shift techs and better benefits. I cried in her office and she handed me tissues saying I'd earned this through my work performance, not pity. The financial stability from the raise helped me feel secure in my apartment for the first time. I wasn't constantly worried about unexpected expenses or whether I could afford my medication copays and therapy bills. I bought actual furniture instead of secondhand stuff and started saving money for the first time in years. The promotion also felt like proof that surviving Craig's abuse hadn't destroyed my career or my future. I was building a life that was mine, where my medical needs were never questioned and my professional skills were valued. Some people at work were weird about the promotion, probably thinking I got it because of sympathy about the domestic violence situation. But my supervisor shut that down fast in a staff meeting, pointing out my excellent performance reviews and the protocol work I'd done. I didn't need anyone's approval, but it felt good having my boss publicly defend my qualifications. On the 1-year anniversary of my seizure, I took myself out to a nice Italian restaurant and ordered expensive wine. I sat alone at a table for two and thought about how much had changed in 12 months. A year ago, I was waking up in the emergency room with a head injury, married to someone who'd nearly killed me. Now I was living alone in my own apartment, financially stable with a promotion, going to therapy twice monthly instead of weekly, and I hadn't had a seizure in a full year. My epilepsy was completely controlled again with proper medication management. The marriage ending had been devastating and traumatic, and I still had hard days. But I was building a life where my medical needs were respected and my safety wasn't constantly threatened. I thought about the woman I was before Craig started his wellness obsession, back when I trusted my own judgment about my health. I was getting back to her slowly, with more awareness and stronger boundaries. The divorce was finalized, the criminal case was over, and Craig was living in another state. I had friends who understood what I'd been through and a support system that actually supported me. Sitting in that restaurant alone felt like a celebration of survival and a promise to myself that I'd never let anyone make me doubt my medical needs again. I finished my wine and tiramisu and walked home feeling grateful for how far I'd come, even though the journey had been horrible. I met someone through mutual friends at a barbecue about 15 months after my seizure. His name was Tony, and he worked as a paramedic, so he understood chronic medical conditions from a professional perspective. We talked for 2 hours at the party, and he asked thoughtful questions about my epilepsy management without any weird judgment. When I mentioned taking medication twice daily, he nodded and asked what kind, then had an intelligent conversation about anticonvulsants and treatment protocols. He never once suggested I didn't need the pills or that I should try natural alternatives. We exchanged numbers and started texting, then went on a few dates. On our third date, I took my evening medication at the restaurant, and Tony asked if I'd taken my morning dose. I said yes, and he smiled, saying he just wanted to check. A week later, he set phone reminders labeled with my name to check that I took my evening pills. The first time he texted asking if I'd taken my medication, I started crying at work. Jen asked what was wrong, and I showed her the text message. She hugged me and said this was what care looked like, not control. Tony was checking because he wanted me safe and healthy, not because he was monitoring my dependence or trying to prove I didn't need pills. The difference felt massive. When I explained why I was crying, Tony was horrified and apologized, worried he'd triggered me. I told him the reminder was perfect and meant everything to me. He said his job taught him that medication compliance kept people alive, and he'd never question someone's treatment plan. That conversation made me believe healthy relationships might actually be possible after abuse. My relationship with Tony developed slowly over the next few months, and I was completely honest about my trust issues and trauma around medication. I told him about Craig hiding my pills and researching seizure withdrawal, about the freezer incident and waking up in the emergency room. Tony listened without interrupting and said he was sorry I'd gone through that. He promised he'd never touch my medication or question my doctor's treatment plan. His consistency proved he meant it. He never moved my pill bottles or made comments about pharmaceutical companies or suggested alternative treatments. When I had moments of anxiety about my medication, he'd calmly help me check that I'd taken it, never making me feel crazy for needing reassurance. He met my therapist's criteria for healthy partner behavior, and she said I was doing good work maintaining boundaries while letting someone new in. Tony was patient with my hypervigilance and understood when I needed space to process triggers. He came to a support group meeting with me as a guest and listened to other survivors' stories, then thanked me for trusting him enough to share that part of my life. His respect for my medical autonomy helped me believe I could have a relationship where my epilepsy was just a normal part of life, not a weapon someone used against me. We moved slowly, and I never felt rushed or pressured. He understood that rebuilding trust after medical abuse took time, and he was willing to prove himself consistently through his actions. 2 years after my seizure, I had my regular appointment with Dr. Cooper, and he reviewed my charts with a satisfied expression. I'd been seizure-free for 24 months with perfect medication compliance and stable blood levels. He said this 3-year milestone qualified me to reduce monitoring appointments from every 6 months to twice yearly. Dr. Cooper joked that he'd miss seeing me so often, but was thrilled my epilepsy management was so stable and well-controlled. I thanked him for believing me when I reported the medication tampering 2 years ago, for calling the police and taking the danger seriously. He said advocating for patients was literally his job, but his voice was warm when he added that he was glad I was safe now. I told him his intervention saved my life, and he nodded, saying he knew how close I'd come to dying from that seizure, or from future ones if Craig's sabotage had continued. Walking out of his office, I felt this wave of gratitude for the doctor who'd treated me for years, and recognized abuse when he saw it. Some medical professionals might have dismissed it as a marital dispute, or told me to work it out at home. Dr. Cooper understood immediately that deliberate medication interference was life-threatening, and he acted on that knowledge. Reducing my appointments to twice yearly felt like another marker of healing and stability. My epilepsy was controlled, my life was rebuilding, and I had people around me who respected my medical needs without question. I started reaching out to old friends I'd lost touch with during the marriage. Sarah was the first person I called, someone I used to have lunch with every week before things got weird with Craig. She picked up on the second ring, and her voice got emotional when I explained what had happened. She admitted she'd been worried about how I'd pulled away from everyone, but didn't know how to bring it up without seeming nosy. We met for coffee the next week, and she brought up specific things she'd noticed, like how I stopped coming to group dinners and always had excuses about Craig needing me home. I told her I didn't blame her for not saying anything because I wouldn't have listened back then. She introduced me to 2 other friends from our old group, and we had an honest conversation about the warning signs they'd all seen. They mentioned how I'd stopped talking about my hobbies, how I always checked my phone anxiously, how I made myself smaller in conversations. Hearing them describe my behavior from the outside made me realize how much I'd changed without noticing. We made plans to meet regularly, and it felt good rebuilding connections with people who knew me before Craig. 3 months later, I got a text from Tyler inviting me to his wedding. I stared at my phone for a solid minute, trying to figure out if it was some kind of mistake. He called that evening and said he wanted me there because I was family for 2 years, and what happened with Craig didn't change that. The wedding was small, and I almost didn't go, but my therapist encouraged me to face it. Several of Craig's aunts and uncles approached me quietly during the reception to apologize for believing the addiction story. His uncle pulled me aside and said he felt terrible for not questioning Craig's claims more carefully, especially since I'd always seemed responsible and put together. Karen wasn't there, and when I asked Tyler about it, he said she'd refused to come because I was invited. He told me she was still insisting Craig had done nothing wrong and was persecuted for trying to help his sick wife. Tyler said it sadly, like he knew his mother was wrong but couldn't get through to her. I realized her denial wasn't my problem to fix anymore, and that felt freeing in a way I hadn't expected. My therapist told me during our next session that we were moving to monthly maintenance appointments instead of weekly intensive therapy. She said I'd done remarkable work processing the abuse and rebuilding trust in my own judgment. We'd spent months unpacking how Craig's gaslighting had made me doubt my medical needs and my perception of reality. She pointed out that I was setting healthy boundaries in my new relationship, communicating clearly about my needs and not accepting behavior that made me uncomfortable. I still had moments where I got anxious about my medication, checking the bottles multiple times or panicking if I couldn't immediately find them, but those moments were getting less frequent and I could usually talk myself down without spiraling. The anxiety didn't control my daily life anymore, and I'd learned coping strategies that actually worked. She reminded me that trauma recovery wasn't linear, and I might have setbacks, but the overall trajectory showed real healing. 8 months into dating my partner, we started looking at apartments we could afford together. The conversation about moving in together felt completely different from when I'd moved in with Craig. We sat down and had explicit discussions about respecting each other's medical needs and personal boundaries. I told him about my anxiety around medication, and he suggested we set up a shared space in the bathroom where both our prescriptions would go, so mine wouldn't feel singled out or monitored. We talked about division of household responsibilities, financial contributions, and what we'd do if conflicts came up. Setting up our shared space with this level of clear communication felt like proof I'd learned from the past, without letting it destroy my future. He never made me feel crazy for needing these conversations, or like I was being too cautious. When we unpacked my medication bottles in our new bathroom, he asked where I wanted them, and then never touched them again, unless I specifically asked him to grab them for me. My supervisor called me into her office 6 weeks after we moved, and I immediately got nervous thinking something was wrong. Instead, she told me the hospital was promoting me to lead tech supervising the evening shift radiology team. The position came with a significant pay increase and the opportunity to mentor newer techs coming into the department. She said my professionalism throughout everything that happened, plus my work on the domestic violence protocols, demonstrated real leadership qualities. I accepted immediately, and felt this rush of pride that my career was moving forward despite everything. In my new role, I made a point to check in regularly with my team about their lives outside work. I watched for signs of the kind of control I'd experienced, like people becoming isolated or anxious, always checking their phones, making excuses to leave early or stay late to avoid going home. I couldn't save everyone, but I could create an environment where people felt safe talking about problems before they became dangerous. 2 years after the seizure, I woke up in my apartment next to my partner and realized I was genuinely happy with my life, in ways I couldn't have imagined during the crisis. My epilepsy was well managed with perfect medication compliance and no breakthrough seizures. My career was thriving with the lead tech position giving me both financial stability and professional satisfaction. My relationship was healthy and respectful, built on clear communication and mutual support for each other's needs. I'd built a support system that respected my boundaries, including friends who checked in regularly, coworkers I trusted, and family connections through my partner. The trauma had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. I'd learned that leaving abuse takes courage and rebuilding takes time, but both are absolutely worth the hard work. Some mornings I still checked my medication bottles twice, but that hypervigilance was fading as I proved to myself every day that I was safe now. Looking back at the person who'd hidden pills in tampon boxes and torn the house apart searching for medication in the freezer, I barely recognized her. That version of me had been so focused on surviving that she couldn't imagine actually living again, but I'd made it through to the other side and built something better than what I'd lost.